You're tuning into an episode of the Redefining Society podcast, hosted by Marco Ciappelli. Let's face it, the future is now. We live in a hybrid analog digital society, and we must stop ignoring it or pretending that technology is not affecting us. The line between the physical and virtual worlds has become a figment of our imagination. On it, we are continually performing a dangerous balancing act, juggling convenience, privacy, freedom, security, technology, society, culture, and even the future of humanity. There is no better place than here, and no better time than now to muse on our relationship with technology and how to redefine what society means in this new age.
BugCrowd's award-winning platform combines actionable contextual intelligence with the skill and experience of the world's most elite hackers to help leading organizations identify and fix vulnerabilities, protect customers, and make the digitally connected world a safer place. Learn more at bugcrowd.com. Black Cloak provides concierge cybersecurity protection to corporate executives and high-net-worth individuals to protect against hacking, reputational loss, financial loss, and the impacts of a corporate data breach. Learn more at blackcloak.io.
Marco.
Sean.
Did you pull the plug?
Yeah, but it's still going.
Somehow it stayed online. I don't know. How is that possible?
That's the biggest fear. Can you unplug, really?
I saw you drag away and the plug was still attached.
It still freaks me out that when you turn off your iPhone or smartphone, it's still going to track you. So
That's right.
I don't know. And it's not about closing the computer and closing the door anymore and everything is going to be fine. So I don't know if you were going to go with this, but that's what I'm thinking about.
There you go.
I must admit, during COVID, I sort of, when we had bans on like going out more than once a day, it was like, look up the phones in a cupboard somewhere. We're going for work. Don't bring them with you.
Toss it in the freezer. That's what I was told. My GPS says I'm in the freezer all the time. I don't know.
No, inside the microwave probably works too.
They'll probably mess up things a little bit.
Not with it on. Inside the microwave.
Oh boy. If it was that simple, that would have been fun.
Mixed signals there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're having fun, but we're about to get pretty serious. I think we'll still have fun along the way. But we're looking at the state of resilience, I think, across the globe. I mean, really. And we're going to look at clearly the world of cyber. Obviously, Marco's on, so we're going to be looking at the world of geopolitics and political science and how we as a globe can work together to stay alive. I think that's in the biggest picture for me. That's what I'm interested in. And it all starts perhaps with that cable, maybe a big one that goes undersea. Who knows? We're gonna have a good chat with Dr. Melanie Garson, who's on the show. Doctor, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And this is triggered. This is going to be published on both our channels, Marco. Redefining Society, Redefining Cybersecurity, and it was prompted or inspired by a talk that you had already given. Doctor. And so we're going to dig into that. The title of that talk was Hurricanes, Hacktivists, and HPCs Building Resilience for the Compute Era. And I'm excited to get into it. But before we do that, a bit about who you are, what you're up to, and what prompted you to put that talk together.
Thank you. Well, I'm Dr. Melanie Garson. I'm sort of wear two hats, both of them good, I think. I'm the Cyber and Tech Geopolitics lead at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. I'm also an associate professor at University College London in the political science department, where, amongst other things, I teach my baby. It's called From Cyber Warfare to Robots, the Future of Conflict in the Digital Age. And so my whole world is thinking about new and disruptive technology. I mean, in that course, we go from cyber through to things like brain-computer interfaces and genetic engineering of Soldier 2.0 and anything that could really shake up how we think about life, society, future, defense, stability. But so a lot of what I do in both places is really think about what is the structure of stability of the world order and how that's being reshaped, particularly by new technologies, or who are the owners, holders, or the distribution of those new technologies and how that potentially reshapes the world order, and what we need to do to rethink that, to have a sort of if internet and everything on it is becoming increasingly a public good, or the lifeblood of everything we do, is it always going to be there when we need it?
Well, I wrote down in my head about 25 to 30 questions for you already. So maybe I'll let Sean go. But one point I want to make is, as a political science graduate myself, back in the days, we didn't even talk about this kind of things. I'm like talking in the 90s when I finished political science, and it was more military oriented. There was still the technology always a big part in every war, obviously in the past, even when technology was a sword or then a gun or whatever. But now it's out of control. And your point about involving the private sector, it's really, really interesting to me. So, Sean, is that interesting to you?
No, it's not. Of course it is. No, but I just published a podcast. You were on this one with me as well, Marco, with Kate Esprit, where we were looking at the Latin American region, South American region. And one of the things that we talked about there that I think we can bring into this conversation is the idea that the technology that you choose to use as a nation, as a region, can shape and potentially position you on the political stage, geopolitical stage, in one way or another. Just by selecting one technology, you might align yourself with another country that you may or may not share the same values with, but there you are. And I think I connect that to kind of the digital divide, where oftentimes it's brought down to the consumer level, but I think it's going to impact nations as well and states as well. Those that have the funds and the skills and the people to really understand what they're doing and why they're doing it with using the technology is really going to define how they sit in this grand world stage that we're all on. So, any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's a really good point, and the point that so I think we've got already that fundamental divide on multiple levels. One is that who the baseline infrastructure providers are. And if you're looking at whether it's Huawei, that sort of, I've just come back from Africa and at a cyber conference, the two big presenters there, Huawei and Kaspersky. Right. And, and they've made massive inroads. They've been reliable partners for these states. And fundamentally, then for those states trying to connect in a cyber secure way with other states, that's already challenging when we're looking at zero trust supply chain. So there's sort of already that element. But this infrastructure development picture, it's so multifaceted in the fact that there's still baseline infrastructure to get in place to be able to enable the big partners to come in. And something like compute, like big, large-scale compute, it's so far off the radar screen. But then you get these sort of weirdness things where you get a country like Senegal that buys a supercomputer because they want to be on the list of countries that have a supercomputer. And it's literally unplugged in a basement because they don't have an ecosystem to build it, to actually use it. So these divides are becoming more accelerated, both from a geopolitical context, and because of that geopolitical context, it's widening the gap for spaces for other companies to go in and invest in. So it's not necessarily an easy or pretty picture.
Was it somehow predictable and we just didn't worry so much about it? And where I'm going with this is because I just had a conversation about the TikTok ban with Theresa Python. And so, talking about other way that you can fight wars nowadays, manipulation, information, collecting data and all of that. And how, the ban may not be the right solution, but then we start looking at, Highway and how that as an hardware and provider of 5G and all of that was actually something that was even more worrisome. So did we just let it get in like the internet? Let's just start the internet. We worry about security, or is this something that we could have somehow predicted at a political level?
I think we could have predicted it. I think the West as a whole, and this goes across all their foreign policy, investment, development, has been, I think they're enthusiastic but fickle. They like to go in for short periods of time and they don't play the long game. China, Russia plays the long game. And they did. And although some of that infrastructure, and we've heard the stories particularly of sort of roads that lead to nowhere, but there's sufficient reliance in those places and southern places. If you go to places in Southeast Asia, can they live without Google search? Absolutely. Can they live without their fundamental infrastructure? Not at all. So, and that then is skewing things like conversations in the ITU. This is sort of where the intersection, I think, I didn't really anticipate, when you're trying to stop something like IP6, or where you're looking at those conversations to keep the free, open, interoperable internet. And countries are automatically then going to vote with their infrastructure provider, even if they're not really thinking about the impact of that, because that's got such power over their system. So I think it's all the confluence of that. And to replace it now, the US has done some rip and replace programs in some places in Eastern Europe, but that's a massive cost. Although I was on my travels a couple of weeks ago, saw a new startup that's doing very, very cool stuff on the fiber optic layer, actually, on being able to create security at that fiber optic layer. And my first question to them was, would that mean that fundamental sort of using subsea cables from places like Huawei, would you now be able to have data complete security over those, whoever the infrastructure provider was? And their answer to that was actually technically yes. So I think we're getting to spaces where we can still protect and keep privacy and data security on those layers, but that's only just coming up now.
And of course, privacy, confidentiality, just one piece of the puzzle, especially when we're talking about resilience. You say, can they live without Google, or can they live without infrastructure? There's a physical element to this, which is one of the things that struck me with the abstract for your talk. I think we often, certainly in the cyber world where we're looking at IT, perhaps OT systems and software, we often forget that beyond those systems, there are other things, right? Critical infrastructure, pipes, wires, cables, all this stuff. How do you see this coming together in terms of who's looking after it? in terms of policy and an understanding of where we, the greater we, are at risk?
I think the greater we are not thinking about it enough. That's why I've got a little bit of an obsession about it at the moment, because I call it the kind of what lies beneath problem. So the conversation right now, particularly because everything's about generative AI and everything's about building advanced tools, and it's kind of like we're layering and layering stuff on the pyramid, and the cyber conversation is, okay, we need to protect all these advanced tools that are going to wreak havoc over the system as people sort of try and integrate them faster than anywhere else. And then there's this sort of whole layer of infrastructure, particularly fundamental communications infrastructure, there's some of which is quite legacy right now. So forget, we have the OT problem, but also where, people just take for granted that it's just going to be there. And I think what we've seen we've seen it previously in instances of, say, the volcano in Tonga that took out their subsea cable for 6 weeks. It went out, but people think, well, it's a little island in Tonga. That's not how important to them, but it doesn't come home. But for me, for instance, this is where you get this confluence. That's why the name of my talk was sort of hurricanes, hacktivists, and HPCs, because where do we get all the three, like that real triple whammy coming in? So you get things like the hurricanes. We saw that in West Africa a couple of weeks ago. It wasn't even a hurricane, minor motion on the seabed, knocked out one of the major cables. And most of West Africa lost internet quite significantly, to the point that the Kenyan Stock Exchange had to stay open for extra trading that night because they lost so much sort of productivity time. So we've got this real economic impact of what's going on. Or when, if we combine that then with hacktivism also coming into it. So when people said, when Houthis started attacking in the Red Sea, and people asked me both, kind of with my geopolitical hat on rather than my cyber hat on, what are you worried about? And my first point was the cables. And they're like, what are you talking about? It's like, if you looked at some of the Telegram channels, the Houthis were already showing pictures of the subsea cable network and saying, let's throw the West, into the dark. So a sort of Houthi backs supporting hacktivist groups. And so then, and eventually a cable got hit. Now, whether that was deliberate or whether that was, just because you've got so much movement going on, something's bound to happen. Then I know that people don't clock that 24% of the traffic between East and West was affected, which was a massive amount. And think about who gets, picks that up. And then you take somewhere like Taiwan, where you bring in the HPCs, where we're relying on their semiconductor. Right. And, they had an earthquake. So you've got one of the most significant places for our whole internet compute infrastructure that we look at, on one of the worst located places on Earth. It's in plate tectonically challenged, let's also put it that way. Hacktivists, I think they had something like last 2023, they had a 3,370% rise in cyber attacks, particularly in advance of the elections. And, we're dealing with our semiconductors. So when the earthquake happened a couple of weeks ago, everyone's like, oh my God, what's happening with, how will that affect semiconductor trade? Of course, I thought cables. In 2006, when they had a similar event, 22 cables went down in that whole area. So it's really this confluence of all three that makes us think, okay, well, what happens when it goes down? We're pushing up to the skies, right? And that's reliant on one very quixotic individual as to whether we have connectivity right now. And that's being polite. and are we really thinking about our national level, global resilience in the hands of that person? Do we need to be thinking that out better?
All right, glad you went there.
It'll be grand.
Yeah, because I'm still thinking about, you teach international negotiation, and again, I like always to think the past and where we are and where we're going to be. So before, was it just a diplomat work? You meet there as a state presence and you try to figure out things, which is still happening, at least in the news, but there's so many players, as you're just explaining right now, that are commercial players that have control over things. So you mentioned, now we go in space, now you're talking about activists, and I'm thinking despite the technology that we have, all you have to do is really go and cut the cable, no more phone in your house anymore. Or so how does the dynamic of this kind of international conflict resolution negotiation take place now that we have to involve very powerful commercial private entity that can make good or bad weather.
Yeah, and I think this is something that's really accelerated since the Ukraine conflict, where we've seen that these actors, whether it's Microsoft, Amazon, Starlink, coming into play. And so increasingly, I certainly know in the US that some of these key decisions have had, Microsoft in the room. Microsoft has now an office in opposite the UN. They're part of, they're sort of capitalizing for these conversations. They have a Department of Digital Diplomacy and that thinks about it a little bit more. But there's two elements to that. One, there's a real tension in thinking about, well, we have to accept where these companies are. We have to think about but do we know how they will act within the system? You're an ex-political, you're still a political scientist. Stability comes from the, rules-based order, having a rough idea of how actors are going to react in any given situation. But these are still private companies. They have shareholders. They answer to a whole different body as well. So one of the things I've argued for a while is to say, well, it's a good plug for tech companies to hire more political scientists, but do tech companies on their boards actually need to have some sort of digital alongside their ESG? Do they, because we have no sense of what will be their decision-making procedure as to how they intervene in different places and how they deal with those challenges. So it wasn't simply Russia, Ukraine, because there was a lot of questions with backbone infrastructure providers going out, and was that right? Because it meant that you couldn't get normal information, you couldn't get counter information to normal Russian people. But we've seen that more acutely, if not a little bit, within Israel-Hamas conflict, where now that Google AWS runs Project Nimbus, which is the Israeli sovereign cloud, and people reacting about that. And, the question of, can companies control what's in their data, can see the data that's in the cloud and control what it's used for? Should they be able to? Should they be value neutral? Where does this sit in this bigger picture? So I think what I would argue for, we need better clarity, we need better commitment, with sort of a sense of what's that code of conduct going to look like, or do we begin to bring them in to a new version we're seeing it more and more, but into those global conversations and recognizing their geopolitical significance.
And it's funny, as you're talking, I'm thinking, who has the power to control or manipulate all that stuff? But as you were starting to talk about that, all I could think about was power, and like literal plugging power. I know data centers for a long time, and I'm sure they still do, rely on backup power units for when local power goes away. But we're talking about resiliency of critical infrastructure and power plants, and we see those getting blown up, right? And even if we figure out the technology to power all the stuff we want to do with supercomputers and all these AI and advanced graphics and all this other stuff that we're envisioning, quantum computing, whatnot. The more we rely on those technologies, when we achieve them, the more we're relying on the power and the backup power and the electricity and everything, generating it, storing it, all that stuff. So because you touched on ESG too, which I think is, how do we generate that power is another part of it. So I don't know, it's a big bucket there, but thoughts?
No, it's a massive question. One of the things, we recently did an access to compute index, and part of that was, looking at, particularly for this digital divide question. And as I said, the amount of, where countries invest and what are the levers for their investment. There's no amount of supercomputers that you can build that will increase your cloud access. You need to deal with your baseline power grid resilience, which is, very sketchy. I think there are models, and I think this is where we begin to look at, responsible compute. And I think, recently Sam Altman, who was on Lex Fridman podcast, he was talking about compute being the new currency or being the new most precious commodity. But are we going to actually have to think about, I call it compute diplomacy, right? Do we need to think about where there's models of clusters where you build the power hungry bit in the place that's most equipped to create that sustainable power, whether that's Norway, where you can make it, there's submerging data centers where you can use, or where you can make sure that the power that's generated is going back into the power grid. So there's lots of potentially clever, sustainable solutions that you could do with it. But yeah, I think keeping the power grid safe, I mean, that's the other bit, both from a cyber perspective, again, loads of OT devices within power grids that make it super challenging across the board. And, keeping it running for our needs is going to be one of the greatest challenges that we have to do. And I don't know, I sat through a cyber simulation game. It's actually with the CLTC in Berkeley. They did a paper recently on the future. I think the simulation I was in this sort of desolate AI wasteland where power has to be rationed because of the huge consumption of power. That's that real Cormac McCarthy, the road, but the desert one.
Yeah, you said ration. I was thinking earlier about the rationing petrol fuel. Right, when things are tough, standing in line to get your share.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm thinking so the priority now, when there is a conflict, it seems to me that when you look at Ukraine or you look at other wars that are happening right now, it's about hitting the infrastructure, try to put the regular population into a state of difficulties in the winter, or cutting the electric grid, attacking the airport. I mean, that's still the same old, let's say, game. But in the future scenario where, it seems to me that it's going to change into, who control the computer. Before we used to try to control the media, right? I mean, as soon as you get somewhere, and during the World War, you will get to the radio station and the TV, because if you control communication, I'm not quoting George Orwell here, but if you control the past and the books and the information, you're controlling everything. Now it seems like it's so much more layers there that, what is the primary resource now? Is it computing power, really? What is it?
I think data is still part of it. And I think, it's, it's multi-domain warfare anyway. And that's why I think it's interesting. I mean, Russia, when you look at Russia's conception of cyber operations, they don't separate between information warfare and what we would think of as sort of cyber attacks. Either it's all part of their strategic conception in one go. And so it's that multi-domain warfare element. And so I think as we saw with Ukraine, one of the key things was they had all their data on premises in country. There's a question of sovereign data, and AWS and Microsoft worked very quickly and diligently to get it out of country. That was key for them, keeping their DIA app, their digital identity app, working for people, but also then denied, and I think this is where we get this question of companies again, they denied Russia a huge part of their strategic ambition. They tipped the balance of power by saying you couldn't capture that data, you couldn't hit that data if that was, so, what was their strategic ambition? Then Russia had hit Viasat, they tried to hit the communication, normal strategic point, hit the comms, capture, right? Starlink came in, tipped the balance of power again. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of electronic warfare right now. But I think what's really interesting, particularly on the warfare thing and where we're becoming to rely on I'm increasingly interested in where the electromagnetic spectrum is playing in this and electromagnetic warfare, because I think it's where this GPS jamming is becoming crucial as part of defensive architecture. And yet we're relying on GPS. We're building in, again, advanced AI-enabled tools that rely on GPS for our daily lives. So there's, great stories right now, particularly if you're in Israel right now, and they've got GPS jamming in place, that you open your telephone and your telephone will say you're in Beirut, or you're in Jordan, or you may be as far, any sort of number of places, because you try and pick up your Deliveroo or equivalent. Let's say you're very far from home right now. But that's had meaningful impacts. So, for instance, there was an instance on the northern border where they've got advanced AI-enabled sort of crop dusting drones and tractors or whatever. And younger generations don't know how to operate the machinery without the GPS aspect of it. So they had to haul 70-year-old farmers out and say, you know what, you're going to have to drive the tractors because nobody else can use it without the GPS. So really thinking about what happens at that intersection, and do you make it resilient? How do you make your daily life resilient at times that security requires you to do that level of jamming?
I just, it's coming out next week. Just recorded an episode. A gentleman named Philip Miller. He's a CISO and a farmer. And we talked a lot about this, about the tech-driven farm and how much reliance there is on the satellites and information and other sensors and other technologies to keep things running and bring costs down for the farmers so that we can actually afford food. And obviously the supply chain is a whole nother story as part of that as well. If the trucks can't keep cold because the computers on the trucks are wonky, or if they can't find their way to the store because the GPS is out, it's just endless, sadly, an endless stream of opportunities for bad things to happen.
Yeah. I think it's... I know, I'm just to say, I think it's rather we think of, we've always talked about the kill chain. I think we need to think about a kill web, because it's certainly not a kill chain anymore. It's a lot more interconnected.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, I get reflection as we start wrapping here. The community, the academic community having this conversation is very important. I'm sure states are having this conversation. Conferences are helping with this, where you connect legislators with technologists, and especially in cybersecurity. But I don't think as the regular population we realize that, like you just mentioned the farming, but I can think of many people that without the GPS, they probably wouldn't be able to come back home. And that's just a little thing. And how many layers we have, again, it's almost like to the point where you can't visualize it. I've cut in the cable, the phone cable at your house. Therefore, you don't have phone anymore, because it's so much more complex than that. That we just are so embedded in our technology that we just don't realize how many things can affect that, from the healthcare system to, medical devices, and we can make a never-ending list of this. So.
Well, the lesson for me there, because I used to live in a place where there were fires. And I used to have a landline, thinking I'd like to have the landline because that's where they notify the people in the area that there's a fire. Except that doesn't work if the poles are burnt. So, we'll just use cell signal. Well, guess what? There's no cell signal in this area that I lived. So I can't rely on that. So you turn to a different mechanism. You have
shortwave radio. Yeah.
Exactly.
Shortwave radio. Yeah. Every house should have a shortwave radio.
There you go.
I
remember reading an article.
Back to the basic waves. Yeah. The radio waves still work really good.
But you talk about the information. Yeah. The information architecture. That was one of the things that happened in Russia because all the backbone internet companies had to come out, Cogent, Lumen. There was issues with providing VPNs and, for all the US countries, where it reshaped within Russia, the information access. But people still wanted to get that counter information to Russians of what was happening. How do you read that? And that's the first thing that Russians started doing. They started dusting off their shortwave radios on the attic. And that's where you suddenly got a rush where BBC and I think also public broadcasting from the US suddenly sort of reinstated some of their Russian language programs to start getting that counter information through.
Yeah, remember that. Yeah, that article. Well, fascinating.
It is. Well, as we close here, and Marco might have a similar question to me that sometimes I remember to ask, not always. But and it's a big question, looking to the future, what can we do to redefine cybersecurity so that we have a safer environment to live in?
A great question.
Billion dollar question.
Why is it $1 billion question for some companies? I think cyber security, I think certainly the challenge I would say to the entrepreneurs, the companies, is to look down the stack, look at where the future of resilience is. It's super, business email compromise. Yeah, I get it's massive business. AI is accelerating it, but look down the stack as to where, as I say, I saw great tech that was looking at using fiber optics, really smart physics, like very, very, very smart physicists of looking at how you can then build security on the fiber optics. But let's look at what the alternatives. And I think we definitely need to be looking at the resilience of the whole space communication system. There's going to be a push up to space. So cyber for space communications and for the receiver stations. So also remembering what is the whole chain. As I say, we're really good at the application layer of bits of we'll do the satellites, but where are the satellites speaking to? Because there's another vulnerability. So really having that picture of what is the vulnerability chain. So if I were a brilliant technical person, which I can only give the ideas of the brilliant technical people, but that's what they keep in mind, step back. There's a thing on the Japanese art of swordsmanship where they always say, imagine your enemy, look at it as if you're standing off a far off mountain. So stand back, look at the whole, whether it's, vulnerability web, vulnerability chain, and then think about where's those weaknesses that people are forgetting and secure them.
Nice one.
Yeah, I love it. Yep. They're all this stuff up there, but then how do we get the message? You can have all the radio wave in the world, but if you don't have a receiver in your house, it's just going to go through.
Exactly.
So I like the idea. It's like when they say, maybe look at what is very close to you, and that where maybe the weak element. So very, very,
and don't
very
blame people.
That too.
Well, I blame Marco.
Well, great. Yeah, blaming them.
Because remember, he's the one that drove the car away that pulled the undersea cable with him. I don't know how you did it. But
I cannot not think about Airplane, the movie where
that's right.
Whoops. Well, great conversation, Dr. Garson.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed
Fantastic.
it. Sean is a geek for cybersecurity. I geek out on this kind of thinking. So glad that we did this, all of us together, got different angles, and hopefully we'll get to meet you in one of our London trip and stay in touch with all the things that you do.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Keep up
Thank
the
you
good
so
fights.
much. Likewise. Okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
BugCrowd's award-winning platform combines actionable contextual intelligence with the skill and experience of the world's most elite hackers to help leading organizations identify and fix vulnerabilities, protect customers, and make the digitally connected world a safer place. Learn more at bugcrowd.com.